Welcome to the GS Podcast. I'm Stephen Knight. How are you? Good? Good. Once again, spoiling you with a spectacular guest. Andrew Doyle's returning, everybody. Andrew is a comedian, he's a writer, he's a devastating satirist, he's the brains behind the hilarious satirical character Titania McGrath. I really hope you've seen this. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. We'll talk about it on the podcast. Also authored a book via Titania McGrath as well, Woke, A Guide to Social Justice. It's one of the funniest things I've read in a long time, and there's another book on the way, which we'll talk about on the show. But I like Andrew a lot. Always love hearing him speak. Always love reading his writing. It's so insightful and level-headed. He's the kind of person I'm very keen to point to when I want to recommend what people should read on the culture wars and the excesses of social justice and intersectional movements. I think he gets the balance perfectly, and this is a very tricky area. It is a tightrope act, and he somehow manages to nail it every time. So I'll put a link to his writing in the show notes as well. But this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I think we touched on media impartiality, you know, the difference between a journalist and an activist. What else? The whole conversation surrounding pronouns. I think we touched on critical thinking, the indoctrination of children. We even spoke about Joe Biden at some point, and Andrew shares his Netflix recommendations. So plenty covered and more. I think one of the things me and Andrew both talk about on this podcast a little bit is what a cesspool Twitter has become in terms of the abuse and uncharitable comments. And they do stick out like a sore thumb. I know, many of you are perfectly lovely and don't engage in that. So if you've enjoyed hearing from Andrew, send him some love, send him some feedback. I'm sure he'll appreciate it in between the accusations of Nazi, racist, bigot, etc., which is what you can come to expect on a regular basis now if you look at certain movements and ideologies through a critical lens. So not only are these people delving into areas that need scratching at, but they do pay a fair cost, which is measured in reputation and just mental energy as well. So send him some love, send him some feedback, send him some kind words. I'm sure he'll appreciate it. You can find Andrew on Twitter at andrewdoyle_com. It might be worth mentioning this conversation was recorded before the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests and riots we've seen across America, so that doesn't come up for that reason. I think that's something me and Aaron will probably turn our attention to on a later episode. So all I have to say on that at this moment is stay safe. But you can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy. It's a great pleasure to welcome the return of Andrew Doyle to the GS podcast. Andrew, how the F are you?
I'm really quite well, actually. It's interesting to be doing this under lockdown conditions. I assume be doing a lot of gotcha questions for me today, because I've seen that so much at the moment.
Yeah, that really does seem to be the flavour of journalism at these press briefings, and it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, maybe that's a bigger thing we can talk about in terms of the line between journalism and activism, because I've been getting incredibly frustrated because, I mean, it's a pandemic. I know F all about pandemics and viruses and, medical terms and things like that. So it'd be nice to have someone in the room who can get clarifications and serve the public. But there seems to be a fair number of people content and just getting a pithy soundbite. It seems like you've noticed this as well.
Yeah, this is something that I've been worried about this for a while, this idea that, that journalists are behaving like activists. And obviously we've seen it from the usual suspects. I mean, The Guardian has always, for a long time now, has been an activist paper. The Independent has become an activist paper of late, even to the extent of smearing Brendan O'Neill as far right, and then when presented with evidence that showed that he wasn't, refusing to retract it. What the hell is that all about? So that's like an open admission that they're more interested in smearing someone inaccurately if it's one of their opponents than actual factual accuracy. That's a real scary thing, and I think it's definitely, Am I imagining this? I feel like it's been accelerated because of this pandemic. I feel like people are behaving even more. I mean, you saw the bit in Newsnight the other night with Emily Maitlis, clearly, flagrantly editorialising at the top of Newsnight on the
Yeah,
BBC.
well, you're clearly a Tory shill. That's the that's the response I've had for noticing a blatant lack of impartiality from Newsnight. I was kind of flabbergasted because, as you know, in the UK we have these impartiality rules, and they're not all. Sometimes the lines cross, and it's difficult to know where that line is. But in general, the news reporters do their best to keep an even keel on things. Compared to, say, I mean, the first time I saw American news media, I was completely shocked at how the presenters can just say how something is and it be completely opinionated. And I felt like our system's I felt it was like superior to that in a sense, that we have impartiality. But
I'm a bit smug about it. I was like, because like with CNN has one take, Fox News has another take, but they do tell you what their opinions are, and that's the norm over there. But I thought we didn't do that here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be equally annoyed if the news did something. I mean, I'd enjoy it more, obviously, if it was something that really chimed with my pre-existing worldview and biases, but I'd still be annoyed that the BBC was telling people what to think rather than just covering the big topics of the day. I mean, it's worth mentioning that the BBC has said they accept that there was a breach of due impartiality, they've termed it, and they I think they've said that they'll send some of their employees for correction or something similar.
How did they not notice this? It was so egregious. That's what I find amazing. And how did they not think anyone would react? Yes.
So my theory on this is that the production room there is so insular in its views, and it's only heard one viewpoint so strongly this last week that it was completely confident in making that summary and thought it'd go down well with the entirety of the country. And like you say, it's quite extraordinary. No one put their hand up and said, "Is this going to be an issue?" Yeah,
I know. And like you say, it's if you criticize this, you're seen as defending or defending the people that Newsnight were attacking, and that's not what this is about. They could have said any opinion, like you say, even if it chimed exactly with my own view, I would be disturbed by it, because that's not impartial journalism.
Where are you on the scale of lockdown at the minute, from stay indoors, we're all going to die, to I've had enough and we need to get on with things?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm very much, I've always been of the view that I don't like to express opinions about things about which I know nothing. So I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't want to pretend to know. What I do is I defer to those who have spent their lives studying this stuff. The problem with this is that there doesn't appear to be any more a consensus amongst the scientific community on this. That creates huge problems for me, because I love a consensus. a good consensus, it frees me of the obligation to think about it too much, And I think at the moment, the truth is, I don't know anything about this sort of stuff. I don't know anything about modeling or about how a virus spreads. I just don't have the knowledge. And it looks like, and because there is such a vast array of different opinions about this stuff, it looks like we're only going to know really in many years hindsight, aren't we? Whether lockdown was a good idea or not, whether the costs to mental health and to other conditions that have not been treated as a result of lockdown, whether they outweigh or not, from a utilitarian perspective, which was the right way to go, which was the greatest good for the greatest number. We won't know, I don't think, until years have passed and we're able to look back at it objectively. So I'm very wary of, getting on my high horse one way or the other.
Yeah, I think appeal to authorities, one of them rare fallacies that works in the direction of scientific consensus, usually.
That's it. That's why I don't consider it a fallacy.
Yeah, I agree. So talk a little bit about the now somewhat, some aspects of it have been cancelled. I know you've still got some dates in the calendar, but you and Douglas Murray were about to embark on this excellent looking tour, Resisting Wokeness, and I had tickets for June in Manchester, and I was really looking forward to hearing you two speak. And obviously this pandemic's come along and changed everyone's plans, so what's the status of that at the minute?
Well, it's been cancelled, so right. We were meant to be in Reading tonight, and Cardiff yesterday, and Liverpool tomorrow. We're right in the middle of it, when it was meant to be, and we just obviously couldn't do that. So we ended up cancelling the tour. But what we've done is we've moved the London date, and the London date was at the Hammersmith Apollo. And so we've moved that forward to November the 11th in the same venue and just transferred the tickets over, giving people the option of a refund if they prefer, obviously. But otherwise, we're hoping, fingers crossed, that it can go ahead in November. Of course, at the moment, we just don't know. I've seen all these pictures of theatres preparing for social distancing and literally taking out the majority of their seats, which wouldn't work. So if by November things have returned to some degree of normality, then we will be able to go ahead with that show. And we've also said that we will, look at this again when things change, when circumstances change. We might end up doing the dates from the tour next year. So that's the situation at the moment.
Okay, that's something I'll be keeping my eye on. I was really looking forward to that. I was just saying to you before we started recording that when this whole pandemic kicked off, I thought that might see some of the louder proponents of intersectional ideology and this wokeness virus pipe down a little bit. And you were much smarter than me on this. You saw this coming a mile off. You wrote an article about in Spiked about how people would just co-opt this issue to further their woke agenda. So, I mean, what can you say about some of the ways people have taken this and give it an intersectional spin?
Yeah, I mean, so towards the start of the lockdown, I wrote an article for Spiked, and I was making the point that coronavirus isn't going to kill off the culture wars. But I did say in that article that I hoped it did. I very much do. You know, I would be the first to celebrate if we could just move beyond all this sort of stuff, which a lot of people don't believe me when I say that, because obviously I write so much about it. But and obviously I satirize it through Titania McGrath. But I do that because I care about it and I want it to go away. I do that because I want it to end. The ideal situation for me, in a sense, would be that I would be out of a job, or at least that I would be able to move on to do other things, you know. But it's definitely the case that it has not gone away. In fact, if anything, I've started to see over the last couple of weeks that it's got even worse, if that is possible, the way in which it has been weaponized. I don't know what you think about that. Do you think that, have you noticed this as well?
Yeah.
Like the screeching on social media and the extremity of some of the articles.
Yeah, it's the same thing, really. I mean, these certain hot topic issues within intersectional thinking that tend to take precedence. So you've got skin colour, so you've got your white privilege, you've got the oppression of women, usually under the guise of patriarchy, and trans issues. And it seems that at some point somewhere, someone's found a way to show that the coronavirus is having a more adverse effect on them issues than anything else.
But that's what they will always do. I mean, they will always make this about what they see as social injustice, and they will always bring it back to their points. And that's what they've been doing. And you've seen some really extreme examples. You know, you've seen like Forbes magazine posted an article about how LGBT people should be upset that the rainbow symbol is being appropriated by kids who are celebrating the NHS, right? And I actually wrote a tweet as Titania saying precisely that a few weeks before the article appeared. Honestly, you can predict all this stuff, you know. You've had like Independent going on about manspreading getting worse under the virus because of the way that joggers, you know, run. I can't even begin to give it any kind of credence, you know. People calling it a gendered crisis. I've seen endless articles. There was one today about how, yes, it's killing more men, but it's women who are bearing the brunt of this, you know.
Yeah.
I saw that today. I can't remember what that was in. I think it was a CNN article. It was CNN London, and it was just finding a way to no. Men are not one of the disenfranchised groups that we protect, so we have to skew this and find a way to show how it's disproportionately affecting women. There was a hilarious one in The Guardian about how women are bearing the emotional brunt. And what it was is they'd done a survey of how upset people are about the coronavirus, and more women said they were more anxious than men. And so they've turned that, a story which frankly doesn't represent women in a particularly good light, but they turned that into, oh, well, women are the real victims here. And brilliantly, they had a photograph of this really posh middle-class woman on her smartphone in a roll neck jumper, looking a bit sad. It's really funny. They're always good for a laugh, though, aren't they?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
This stuff is, I'm afraid, not going away, as far as I can see. And I think, if anything, coronavirus is just going to weaponize it and make make it even worse.
So what's the antidote here then? Because these people aren't going away. This ideology seems to be getting more and more frothy mouthed in certain areas. Is it a case of, like, not to use the virus terminology, but is there a peak at some point, and the general public just going to not respond in the way they have previously?
Well, this was my big hope, and this is something that I'd written about before. Is that I knew that too much money, too much clout is behind this movement. There's too many powerful people have invested so much in this. They're not going to stop all of a sudden, and there's a big industry behind it. There's a lot of money to be made out of it as well. So it's not going to go away. But it's always been deeply unpopular with the general public. It's never been something that has persuaded people. It's just we get the illusion that we're persuaded by this stuff because the social justice movement is so powerful within the mass media and the mainstream media and the arts and politics and education and all those major institutions. So we think that it's more accepted than it is. And what I think could happen, and what I do hope will happen, is simply that people will stop capitulating to it, and that people will stand up to it a little bit more. When the HR department calls you in because you were overheard telling a problematic joke, you stand up and you cause a fuss, and you tell other people about it, and people stand up for each other. You see, that's the problem. Is people are nervous about supporting those who are the victims of this thing. And so hopefully that's it. Hopefully, when faced with the actual authentic hardship, or at least a taste of hardship through a global pandemic, and genuine hardship for a lot of people, I'm not trying to undermine that, but all of us have felt, this is actually quite a big deal. And now, and that should put things into perspective. And maybe we'll stop, maybe when we hear this bullshit, maybe when there's an article saying that tomato ketchup is racist or whatever, people will start literally saying fuck off. Maybe that will happen more and more.
So to use another pandemic term, we'll reach some sort of herd immunity to wokeness once we've all been cancelled. Strength in numbers. Everyone's just scared, that's all. They're just I get it. They're just frightened of what happens. They see what happens every day on social media for people who say the wrong thing. And it can happen to absolutely anyone. And so everyone's just a bit frightened of that. And it is horrible. I've been piled on by people on Twitter for things they've imagined I've said, usually. Yeah. And it's not a nice experience. And so I don't wish that on anyone. But yeah, I get it. It's the fear. But it's that thing of safety in numbers, Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you alluded to something earlier about this intersectional ideology and wokeness in general not being particularly popular with the general public, and we see that time again at the ballot, and I suppose that's a way in which people who are not invested in these arguments surrounding culture wars, or would say that it's not a big deal, would point to Donald Trump in the White House. They'd point to Brexit. They'd point to the Tory government, and they'd say, well, it's clearly not an issue. So, I mean, why does it matter in your sense? Why do you think it's something worth focusing your energies on? Well, this is the thing that people miss all the time. What they're doing is they're effectively saying, look, it is nonsense, but by amplifying it or making it worse, you should just ignore it. You just ignore it. That's the way to deal with it. It's nonsense. We'll ignore it. But the problem when you do that is because the thing that you are ignoring is an ideology that is being weaponized and pushed by those in power, those with incredible establishment power in positions in the media, as I say, and higher education particularly. If you ignore it, it will win. That's the problem. It doesn't go away if you ignore it, right? This is a conflict. Ultimately, this conflict is to do with those who believe in critical social justice or intersectionality or whatever you want to call it, wokeness, whatever, against what most of us believe in, which is a liberal society and liberal values. Those two things are totally incompatible, and that's where the culture war is being waged. It's between those two belief systems. If you disbelieve, if you think that this illiberal system that they're trying to implement globally is a bad thing, ignoring it doesn't go away, because illiberal systems, that's how they win. And if you do believe in liberal values, you have to stand up for it and you have to oppose it. So I don't really have much truck with this idea of, oh, well, just ignore it or go away. If it was just idiots in the corner of the internet saying these things, it's not. It's these mainstream publications like the New Statesman, which will lie and misquote Roger Scruton in order to get him fired, knowing it's not true. It's major institutions like the UN,
who are posting tweets talking about how we should all adopt gender neutral language because otherwise we're not being inclusive. It's the Pulitzer Center for the Pulitzer Prize who put a tweet out the other day which read like it was written by Robin DiAngelo, one of those critical social justice theorists, which was all about diversity, inclusion, and equity. Equity being, as you know, that we adjust things for outcomes, not for equality of opportunity. These things are ideological, right? So if you can't even win a Pulitzer Prize unless you're ideologically on board, that's a big deal. If the UN are getting involved with telling you about, if you don't know what the gender of someone's partner is, don't guess, effectively. No one needs that advice, let alone from a fucking international peacekeeping body. This is a big deal. Like I say, I always say this. It's not that I'm worried about the culture warriors on social media. I'm worried about the culture warriors in government and universities and television and these positions of power, because because they actually do have cultural influence.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really interesting what you said there about if you don't agree with this worldview, you should really push back. And I suppose it ties into this idea that a lot of people think that progress or a particular point in time is fixed and that there's no way to go back. So they almost see it's like they made a save on a video game and they can just restart at a checkpoint. And I think someone like John Stuart Mill was always an advocate of this idea of living truth, that you constantly have to flex your arguments, otherwise they just become dogmas and you fall asleep in the field, that kind of attitude. And I think that's spot on. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've heard from a number of people who are being encouraged now to include their preferred pronouns in their email signatures in the office environment. And obviously this puts them as optional, but it's fast becoming noted in the office who's not bothering, and assumptions are being made. And I mean, it might move us on to the topic of pronouns in general, because I don't tend to care how people define themselves. I think it's quite uninteresting in general, and I'd like to think a polite person, so I treat people with respect, and I will grant their wishes in that regard, just so long as they're not absurdly ridiculous. However, you and I have both noticed a definite correlation between those that list their pronouns in their online bios and some of the most abusive intolerance you can imagine. So what's going on in that regard, and how do you feel about this idea of announcing your pronouns or providing them up front in general?
So there's a lot of questions within that, aren't there? So in terms of the I mean, I've noticed this as well of you, and I've asked this question many times, and I haven't really got a satisfactory answer. Is that when I note, whenever I get an incredibly hostile, insulting, or abusive message, or sometimes threatening, on Twitter or something, and I go to the account, it is virtually always the case that person has pronouns in the bio. And then I'm putting out this question and saying, why is this the case? Why is there this clear correlation? And I'm not the only one who's experienced this. This is quite a common experience. Why is there this close correlation? And some people will say, well, it's because you through Titania, you make jokes about pronouns and gender identities, and therefore you've annoyed this contingent. But I also notice that a lot of the people who use the pronouns are not themselves trans.
Yes.
So I don't even know if that is really what's going on there. I also have to say, an awful lot of trans people don't do this thing about the pronouns. The majority of trans people simply want to pass as the gender to which they have transitioned. So this is not something that we can say is the trans community or representative of the trans community. I don't even like the word community there because I don't think it's accurate. So there's that. So I haven't got to the bottom of why it is, but I think what it is that the expression of pronouns is a gesture of ideological fealty. I think it is less to do with the avoidance of awkward situations. Trans people for a long time have found ways and strategies in their day-to-day lives to deal with the fact that every now and then they might be misgendered, and they've got through it. What they haven't done, because what they haven't done is taken the illiberal approach, which is to insist that absolutely everyone, the whole world changes around them, and absolutely everyone has to announce their pronouns to avoid the possibility of offence. So that's why I have a problem, I think, with the announcing of pronouns, because it becomes an expectation. And like you say, when you're not doing it or you're opting out of it, a moral judgment is then made about you, and an assumption, for instance, that you're transphobic or whatever that, or whatever they want to assume about you. So that's why I think it's a problem. The other thing is, I think there's a problem with using they as a singular pronoun, because it's not a singular pronoun, and I think that's something that if we are to accept and if we are to adopt and say I will adopt whatever pronoun you tell me, well, I don't think I would do that. I think I would. I'm happy to if you transition to call you he or she or whatever you want to be called. But I'm not going to call you one of the neo-pronouns, je or je or whatever. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to use they in a singular context, because I believe that we need to retain grammatical standards in order to avoid elitism more than anything. Because otherwise you build up and create this kind of elitist lexicon, which the people in the know how to use. So there's all sorts of problems with this. And furthermore, I don't think there's a big debate going on within the trans community about this. This way that people treat trans people as all being ideologically identical is really insulting, I think. And this isn't something that has been settled, and it isn't something that's been discussed. And I'm very nervous about ultimately where it leads, which is compelled speech. Yeah. Which is, fine, it's optional at the moment, but actually if you want this job, you're going to have to announce your pronouns. You're going to have to say, and at that point, I back out, because I don't believe in compelled speech of any form.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I came to an observation the other day that the people that think that accidentally misgendering someone is a grave, unforgivable offence are also the same kind of people that will misapply labels like white supremacist and Nazi. Yeah. And I tend to think that I'd be more comfortable with being thought of as a woman than a member of the KKK.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I do have sympathy for people who are misgendered regularly, and you can imagine how that I don't deny that could be upsetting. I can see that. Yeah,
we both agree that people can be malicious in that regard, and that's just downright rude in my mind.
Yeah, sure, exactly. And but I think calling someone a Nazi is downright rude.
Yes.
I think that, and that happens just all the time. Am I imagining this? It feels like it's gotten a lot worse. That.
Yeah.
It's sort of escalated. These very casual accusations of racism, which is such a horrible thing to accuse someone of without evidence. It's just not morally acceptable. You can't do. You're not a good person if you do that. I'm sorry. I don't believe that you can be a good person and just casually smear someone in that way. I just don't buy it.
I think as well, I tend to think, I mean, I was brought up here, I was born in the 80s, brought up through the 90s, and I was lucky to come up through a generation where anti-racism was very much on the agenda. There was some dark days before that, and that was always a thrust of my education, and I think I was one of the first generations that had mixed classes, so that it was less of a taboo or an issue. And so being a racist to me was something awful. It's one of the worst things you could be, to judge someone based on their skin colour, and I still feel that way. So when people throw it around so insincerely, it really gets my back up, and it kind of shows that they're weaponising such an incredibly serious and harmful topic just to score points on a social media platform, and I find that quite...
I thought Blair White put it very well, because she tweeted out about how whenever she sees the word racist or homophobe or fascist or something like that, she was saying, I assume it's not real. I assume it's not true.
Right.
And she was making the point of how dangerous that is. And that is, I'm afraid, something I share. I see someone online being called a fascist or a Nazi. I assume it's almost certainly not going to be the case that they're a fascist or a Nazi. And same now with racist and homophobe. So what they've successfully done there is they've sort of deprived us of the ability of identifying these people in our midst, because the accusation becomes meaningless.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what's left, because they do continually blunt these terms to the point where you'll remember that racist was the common refrain from these people, and now it's been superseded by white supremacist. Yes. Racist is so, last year. And it makes you wonder what will be the next step. And obviously, like you say, these words are losing meaning. And I do this too whenever I see somebody being accused as a Nazi. My first thought isn't, oh my God, there's a Nazi. It's let me just have a look at what he said first here, because I know how this goes.
Exactly. It's a problem, isn't it? I can't see how it's serviceable. I can't see what the utility of this is or how it's helpful.
What I noticed that you picked up in your Spiked article about people using this pandemic to further the woke ideology is this continual language we see on campus about safety and the concept of safety.
Yeah.
And how words and misgendering or just the presence of somebody with an opposing view is a direct threat to somebody's safety, or that's certainly how they'll term it. And do you think there's much sincerity in this? I think you called it a rhetorical device in your article, but do you think there are people who generally feel threatened, have their safety called into question by the presence of somebody like Toby Young, or even perhaps you on campus, or me?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the problem lies, is that I have seen evidence that people have worked themselves up into such a mindset that they do feel physically threatened by different opinions and by being challenged. And the emotion, I've seen evidence that a lot of this emotion is real. By the same token, I've seen quite clear examples of where people are saying and using that phrase "unsafe" and not being safe as a means to have someone removed who they do not agree with or like. So I think you have to assess it on each individual case-by-case basis, don't you?
Yeah.
Because I think that's the problem, is that it can be used strategically and has been used strategically. It's been used strategically against me on a personal level when I was running a workshop for stand-up comics, young stand-up comics, and one person said that I had made them feel unsafe because of a joke that I had tweeted as Titania. So therefore, me being in the room made them feel unsafe. Now, that's not true, is it? Let's be absolutely clear about that. That's not true. What that is that someone who doesn't want me to have that job anymore, and is telling my employer about that in order to have me lose the job, which it did do. I no longer work for them. So the use of the phrase "unsafe" there is a strategy, a political strategy with a political outcome. So that's the problem.
Yeah.
Is that even if we discover that there are a lot of people who are genuinely distressed by microaggressions or whatever else it is, there's always going to be a substantial proportion of people who recognize that because people are so risk averse, they will capitulate to this stuff. Again, it comes back to this issue of capitulation. What should happen with an employer, if someone goes to them and says, "Oh, I feel unsafe because this person has an opinion I don't like," the employer should say, "Too bad, that's your problem, because we live in a liberal society." That's what should happen. So the question is always about capitulation, not about the people who do this, who indulge in this stuff.
That's true. It'll only take one prominent employer, to stand by their employees and say, just to say something as simple as we don't respond to social media outrage.
Yes, wouldn't that be a great idea?
Yeah, and draw a line in the sand. And because these people, without the capitulation, like you say, they're quite clearly impotent in this whole battle. And I'm just waiting for that one company that I can throw my money at and my custom for life to stand forward and make that decision. But you mentioned the mighty Titania McGrath there. I've noticed fellow Americans struggle with the first name quite often, which amuses me. But that's blown up beyond imagination now. I mean, this started as something that you did anonymously, and then, you still do it anonymously in a way, but you've since been outed as the creator, and you run that account, and you published a book under Titania, and it's taken you everywhere. Now, I mean, so it's great to see you on the Joe Rogan show, so I'll have to ask you what that was like soon. But how are you feeling about this Titania thing? Is this something that's still keeping you interested?
I can't remember when we spoke before, was I out as Titania at that point?
Not on this podcast, but when we were on Ricky's show a couple of times, I think you was definitely out then.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think when did it start? It sort of started around April 2018, I think. So it's been about 2 years, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And for some reason, there's been a big spike recently over the last month or so of extra followers. There was a big, I don't know why. I wonder if it's to do with like I say, this sort of escalation in the social justice lunacy that we've seen online, which has sort of caused more people to lose patience with it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not something I anticipated, and certainly, but it was great it was great to be able to write the book, and now I've written a second book. That was really fun. And we had a tour plan because I did a live version of the show for the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which was great. And then we booked in to do the tour. We've actually kept the tour dates, but moved them a whole year back. So they're all going on this March 2021. So, but it's been really great. And I am going to continue doing it for now. But I never like doing things for too long. And I feel like I'll know when it's outstayed its welcome. I know there are some people who presumably think it's already outstayed its welcome, but all I can see is that the thing she is satirizing is getting worse and worse. And so therefore there is more need, not less, for this kind of satirical take on it.
It's wonderful. I mean, it seems to annoy all of the right people as well. I've noticed from time to time as well, you'll take a genuine tweet and parrot that verbatim. and it's difficult to know where it originated. It's that in the land of Titania. The lines of reality have been completely blurred now by the rhetoric. I don't think anyone could ever accuse you of strawmanning the situation in that regard.
Well, they do. I mean, that's actually the fairly typical response, is to say that people like this don't exist, and I can always link them to sentiments, similar sentiments that have been expressed by authentic people and sometimes very famous people. So it isn't true. And of course, sometimes Titania will tweet something that isn't real, and it does take it to absolute extremes. And that's the nature of satire. I mean, hyperbole and exaggeration is part of the satirical technique. It's drawing on a bit. I'll give you an example, a recent example. So I did a tweet a couple of days ago, I think it was 2 days ago, and I said, since it is impossible for black people to be racist, any white person who is not being racist is committing behavioural blackface. Therefore, all non-racist white people are racist. Now, obviously, that's not a real person has not said that, but they sort of have in a way. It's satirising that very torturous logic. Like they will twist. They'll find some way to make anything racist and anything about race, and they'll twist it around. It's not that I'm literally saying someone said that, even though actually the sentiment behind it is not a million miles away from what Robin DiAngelo is suggesting, which is that, if you are white, you are complicit in white supremacy.
Yeah.
And actually, even being nice to people of colour is an expression of racism. That's what she said.
Yeah, I mean, it works within the framework of intersectionality, doesn't it? That's why it's so good. You can see the illogical leaps there. Tell me about Joe Rogan. How was that? That must be an amazing experience to be on what is probably one of the biggest shows on the planet now. I think people tend to gravitate towards Joe Rogan for their news and their political discourse now, a lot more than a more official news channels in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and partly it's because it's so long. It's that long form thing that he sort of cultivated. And I mean, he was years ahead of his time on this, wasn't he? Because it just works as a format. You find yourself sort of easing into it and almost like you forget where you are. It's a chat. He's very good at this conversational thing and getting you to open up. I think it's a really good format, and I really did enjoy it. I was so tired when I did it, which maybe helped in a way. But it was good to explore those things at length, and then of course you do, once that goes out, you get a big bump in followers, and there's a lot more people are drawn towards what you're doing, and so there's that added pressure because you also get an escalation in the vitriol as well. So you get that as well, but it's short-lived,
And there's also this idea as well on social media that you are solely responsible for the content and character of the people who choose to click follow. And if you're in the media, you do anything from Sky News onto the Joe Rogan show, which is in the Venn diagram of overlapping interest. You're going to get a mixed bag of people interested in your output there. And I mean, how do you feel about this idea that you can frisk someone's associations on social media and make judgments in that way?
Oh, I think it's abysmal. And I've noticed recently people very much policing what they like, going through and seeing what your likes are, to try and draw conclusions about the sort of person that you are. I had someone attacking me saying, look, you're following the Conservatives here. Why are you following the Conservatives? And I was like, I'm also following the Lib Dems. I'm also following Labour. I'm also, it's this thing about, if you are only following the people who are going to echo your own views back to you, then you're not behaving like an adult, as far as I can see.
I agree. I mean, I follow the Pope. I mean, it's someone's got to keep an eye on him.
The Pope comes out with some great things, and I don't know if I do follow the Pope actually, but you reminded me, I might start following him now.
There you go.
But yeah, right. I mean, this is the thing about the echo chamber phenomenon. It is part of this thing of not wanting to be challenged whatsoever, and it is a broad kind of infantilism, a resistance. I often think a lot of this stuff is people who've been failed by socialization and education, and I think that's why we do need to do something about it. It's a broader cultural problem. And these levels of intolerance. I mean, the insanity we've seen over the past couple of weeks online, from every little thing seems to escalate and become this incredible. It becomes sort of legitimate to express extreme responses to absolutely everything. And I worry that, is it an infantilized culture, or are we in this kind of late stage senility? Is that what it is?
Possibly.
I don't know.
It's instant reward, isn't it, though? You have this vitriolic hot take, and the problem I have with social media now is there's no correction mechanism, even for me. So if I say something ridiculous and wrong, I will find enough people on social media to agree with me and pat me on the back.
Yeah, that's it.
And obviously the nature of us grey apes is to take that as confirmation that we're right. Someone can have the most horrendous hot take on Twitter that's objectively wrong, and it's had 20,000 likes before you've had time to blink. So it's like, it's not the best place to stress test your ideas, really. It's more efficient as a promotion tool nowadays, I would suggest, rather than having conversations.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this, and about, I've been reading an awful lot about critical theory and critical thinking, and how to argue. I just wrote a piece for Standpoint magazine, which is in this month's edition, about how to think, how to argue, and that we have this dearth of critical thinking in our current public discourse. And I think one of the key things that people need to learn when it comes to this kind of engagement with people is that you can only argue with those who are capable of argument. So you can't. If someone shows to you when you're in one of these spats online that they're not acting in good faith, that they don't believe what you're telling them is true, that they think you've got a secret agenda and that they know what that agenda is, or they are willfully misinterpreting what you say in order to straw man you, these are not good. This isn't someone who knows how to argue. Or likewise, someone who just throws insults, who is an abusive, just does this sort of ad hominem stuff. These people are actually incapable of argument, incapable of discourse, and you are wasting your time by engaging with them. And I think part of free speech is knowing when not to listen. And it's like choosing to argue with an infant about something that infant cannot possibly understand. Nothing will be achieved there,
Yeah.
So I think with Twitter, for instance, Twitter can only function once you've got past a certain number of followers. It can only really function if you're using the block button properly. If you just block people who are abusive, it can only really work that way, because those people are never going to come around to your way. I never block someone if they just politely disagree with me. I'm all for that. In fact, I want more of that.
Yeah.
I only block people who are abusive or bad faith in their interpretations or arguments, or are harassing people or whatever. Those that, I say have a very strict rule with yourself, but don't think that you are obliged to respond to someone who is not, who is arguing effectively with themselves.
Yeah, not everybody's worthy of your time in that sense, and that's not to be arrogant. It's just you can't argue with everybody on the internet, as strong as that temptation is. It's something I've definitely got better at over the years. I only dedicate a good 9 hours a day to it now.
You have to pick and choose. I mean, I had it the other day it was one of the Momentum accounts, which just launched an attack on me, and everything they said about me was factually wrong.
Yeah.
They said I was a Tory. They said that I can't remember. There were 4 or 5 things, and I just retweeted it, and then they got worse, and they started just shouting insults, and I suddenly realised I think it's just a kid. I think it's just like a 16, 17-year-old with a smartphone, and then I just disengaged.
Yeah.
It was like arguing with an infant. And I only replied initially because I thought it was quite funny that this political group could be so childish. And actually, there's something quite disturbing about that.
It's funny because when I started blogging and using Twitter and getting into spats and things like that, and then I started going to actual events to debate and panels and talks and other things, and I assumed that level would carry over into the real world, and it very rarely does. You usually find once you've got some people in front of you and you can look into their eyes and talk to them, the conversation tends to go a lot better than it does in 240 characters.
Exactly. So, I reviewed that book by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, How to Have Impossible Conversations. I wrote a review of that for Spike. It's a very good book for this and about this. And they give some really, really great advice about this stuff, very systematic in its approach. And, one of the things they say, which I think, even if you only took this one thing away from the book, one of the things they say is the only assumption you should make about your opponent is that their intentions are better than you think. And I think that if everyone could just keep that in mind, 99% of all these Twitter disputes would go away, because most of them are people. Most of the arguments, speaking personally, most of the arguments I get into about culture and politics are from people who have misunderstood my argument. And that's why this technique of getting people to relay back to you what they think your argument is, that's quite a useful thing to do, because they are literally just shouting at this imaginary creature they've concocted in their mind, and that isn't a productive use of anybody's time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I enjoy that book as well, and that's a great bit of advice. I mean, one of the things that I really valued in that book from an advice perspective is the idea that it's okay to let people be wrong.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a powerful tool to know that actually you don't have to engage everybody in disagreement all of the time. It's okay to let somebody be wrong, unless they're, carrying out open heart surgery or something, then, maybe say something. But yeah, in general, not everything has to be a political skirmish. I was going to ask you about the Titania McGrath book announcement that you've made. You've spoke about this, that you've been working on this for a while now, and the next project for Titania is going to be called My First Little Book of Intersectional Activism. Now, I seem to remember us talking about this before, and you noticed this growing phenomenon of the woke child book, hadn't you? These books aimed at children that were promoting this intersectional worldview.
There's a lot of them, and some of them have been really big sellers. So last year, for instance, there was one called, or was it 2 years ago, Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls, very, very popular, massive bestseller, which goes through various feminist icons, but also includes Coco Chanel, who was the most empowering of all the Nazi collaborators. And then you have it's funny how they anesthetize and whitewash certain elements of people's lives to fit the agenda, but nevertheless, there's also what's the other one? The Little Girl Who Gave Zero Fucks, Feminist Baby, which Joe Rogan told me about Feminist Baby, and there's a new one called Anti-Racist Baby as well, and there's one I tweeted about the other day as Titania, which is the one about a guide. It's called Who Are You? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity. And and this is aimed at, honestly, this is aimed at 5-year-olds. And there's one page where it talks about, here are some of the words that people use: genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, gender neutral, agender, bigender, third. Look, two-spirit is mentioned as well. So this overt politicization is something that I find a little bit troubling. And the problem is, because of the nature of the way that social justice works, is that they don't see this as politicization. They see this as redressing a problem in society and standing up for minority groups. They don't see that what this is actually a deeply ideological worldview. And when it's aimed at children, it can only be described as indoctrination. So it's something that is both funny to me. You're talking to a 5-year-old about genderqueer, two-spirit. That to me there's something quite absurd on the face of it, but there's also something a bit disturbing about it, and that's why I thought I'd do the book.
Are we as a society getting too political in general? Is it consuming more of our time when really it shouldn't be? I mean, I just in my own life, it tends to be one of them things that I don't want to be patronising, but you tend to take more of an interest in political events and current events as you get a little bit older. But yeah. I'm seeing it everywhere, infused in everything now in a way that it wasn't before. Just my own Facebook feed. I mean, it used to be awash with cat pictures or people down the pub, and now it's the hot take on Dominic Cummings or the anti-Brexit vitriol or Brexit postings and things like that. Is it taking up far too much of our time now?
So I wonder whether it's to do with, I mean, for one thing, I think it's actually good when people are politically engaged. I think that's a very positive thing, and I actually think that's a really positive thing that came out of the Brexit referendum, is that for all of a sudden people around the country who genuinely didn't, or usually didn't, and people I know who had no interest in politics, were suddenly talking about politics. And actually, that's quite a refreshing thing. I think the downside of all this is what has happened is that I mean, thanks largely to the way that it was represented in the media, things like Brexit and now, of course, Boris Johnson's government, these become associated with a kind of tribalism. I think it's something that spawned out of identity politics, whereas traditionally we've had identity related to race, gender, and sexuality. I think now your politics has become your identity for a lot of people. And that's maybe why they feel threatened or disturbed whenever that identity is challenged. That's why if you disagree with a political viewpoint, it's taken as a personal insult rather than a challenge in good faith. So I think that might be, I mean, I don't know, right? I don't know, but I wonder if that's part of it, this idea of politics as an identity rather than in a way that religion becomes an identity rather than just a set of values.
Yeah, you often see that, especially with religion. If you speak about a religion in the same way you'd speak about a football team you didn't like, suddenly it becomes a little bit more egregious in that context. There's certain levels and lines people draw when they wed their identity to something, and it just seems, I mean, Douglas Murray touched on this point quite a bit, and it's something that gives me pause for thought. And when he talks about the increasing secularization of our society, which is I'm all for, of course, but it then becomes a case of, well, what fills our Christianity shaped hole? What do we put in there to give us meaning and worth? And I think he seems to posit that people are taking politics on in this sense as a new form of religion. I don't know how you feel about that idea.
Well, yeah, because I don't think religion is necessarily, as I know a lot of people and a lot of atheist writers particularly do, they feel that religion is taken to mean that, this is where we get our values from. And these are the rules and we can stick by these rules. And actually, I think it's more than that. I think religion's more about meaning, which is the word that you use there. I think that's what it's about. And that basic need for some kind of meaning is something that people do get from religion. And they do definitely get from an identity, a strong identity, whether that be politics or social justice or whatever, and it makes them feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And this might be a trite point because I suppose it's quite obvious, but yes, I think that's what it is. But it's also why, just as it's difficult to convince a very religious person that they are wrong, that their faith is wrong, it then becomes very difficult to convince someone who is a political zealot, shall we say, that their viewpoints are not right or should be open to be challenged. And you see it all the time. I think a lot of the abuse and the harassment that you now get from people if you dare to express an opinion they don't agree with is because they feel that their identity has been threatened by you, by your very existence. That should never be the case. And if we're going to grow up as a culture, this is why I always talk about this infantilism thing, but a grown-up culture is able to disagree politely about big, important ideas. And I just crave the day that we can get back to that, if we ever had it.
Yeah. It'd be nice to get the adults back behind the wheel in that sense. You wrote a great article on Joe Biden for Spiked recently. The idea, I mean, it ties back into this idea that there is a political identity to be had, and there's this further nefarious idea now that can also be applied to whole groups of people. So, for instance, in America, it's sometimes expected that the black quote-unquote community, and I join you in not liking that term to describe whole swaths of people, but it's this idea that they should instantly be for the Democrats. They're the party that is for them. Being black is to be a Democrat. And Joe Biden recently made a glib comment/joke on a streamed interview. I think the quote was, "If you've got a problem figuring out if you're for me or for Trump, then you ain't black." This idea that to be authentically black is to have one particular political persuasion. And I was just wondering how that idea has become so embedded within political discourse.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting about that is I have absolutely no doubt that it was an attempt at a joke.
Yeah.
But it is an attempt at a joke that is informed by a premise that is now very much widespread, particularly on the left, or people who identify as the left. You know, if you and the examples I gave in the article, I mentioned the example of Kanye West, who obviously has argued this point before. The expectation that black people would vote Democrat is quite a patronising expectation. Then there was an article in The Atlantic about him, basically saying he wasn't black, as in to be black doesn't mean skin colour anymore. What it means is political ideology. And the same with the other example I gave is Debbie Hayton, transgender woman who was called transphobic because she believes she's still biologically male even though she's had transitional surgery. And then the other example is the Peter Thiel one, the gay entrepreneur who supported the Republicans and therefore was branded in The Advocate, a gay magazine. He was branded someone who has sex with other men but is not a gay man. And I've been accused of being a fake gay, you know, not proper gay. And it's this thing about, it's turning the elements of our humanity into politics, or politicizing absolutely everything. And it's this it comes from this collectivist social justice ideology that doesn't seek justice for individuals. Actually, it seeks justice for groups and the group that you are a part of. And that's why they struggle when a gay person votes Tory, for instance, or, you know, whatever it might be. And I'm not an example of a gay person who follows the line that gay people should follow according to those in the know, you know. And that's why I'm opposed to this kind of identity politics, full stop, is because I think it's patronising. I think it's that soft form of racism that assumes all black people should think the same. And I know that Biden was joking, but it was revealing, wasn't it? I think that's what I mean. I think it was revealing of a broader problem of the encroachment of identity politics into the Democratic Party.
Agreed. That joke only works as a joke if you grant the premise is true.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, have you noticed as well, I mean, this is anecdotal, of course, but I've noticed over the years that those claiming to fight for minority rights, the most zealous of those activists, will very quickly throw out some of the most homophobic and racist language as soon as a black person or a gay person doesn't toe whatever political line they're expected to toe.
Yeah, that's right. You see phrases like Uncle Tom, don't you?
Yeah, House Negro. I mean, I'd never even heard the term coconut before until I started engaging. I had to Google that. That was just not in my lexicon, and that got thrown out to a black man because he wasn't towing the liberal line.
So offensive. It's so genuinely offensive to say that inside you're actually white. You know, it's so demeaning. And yes, there's that's what I mean by soft racism. I think that's why sometimes with Titania I let her racism slip through, because I think she is racist. I think there's a racism at the heart of the social justice movement, as well as a deep-seated homophobia and misogyny. I just think it's there and it's quite palpable. But of course, these are the very things that they're accusing everyone else of.
I must have read Titania's book on woke about 3 times now, and I always manage to crease at the point she makes in the book, or you rather, that people call, I think it's Saudi Arabia, might be Iran used an example, but there've been no recorded misogynistic hate crimes there. Yes, yeah, I remember. Yeah. And that proves that they're more advanced than us. Is that sort of the gist? Yeah, that's the one. And it's so well done. And it's clear that you obviously dedicate a fair amount of your time to reading the core text on this and dipping your toes into them waters. You are informed on what's being said. And I was just wondering, like, I know you understand this is important, but how much, I mean, for me, for instance, I spent a lot of my time, and I still do, in going against religion, and not religion in general or religious belief or religious people, but fundamentalism in religion, because I feel it trespasses on things that I find really important: freedom of expression, liberalism, individual rights, human rights, things like that. And I made it my mission for the longest time to memorize the Quran and the Bible and things like that. And at some point I just thought to myself, you know what, I'm actually losing this argument if I'm dedicating all my time to these things that I don't value. And I just wondered, how much of your time do you think you should be dedicating to this ideology?
That's a really good question, because obviously, we all have finite resources of time, and but by the same token, when it comes to satire, I think the reason why so much satire at the moment is so weak is because the satirists in question don't understand what it is they are satirizing, and what they are doing, in fact, is satirizing a caricature of what they think it is. And that's I think that is a problem, because the satire cannot be effective unless you know it well. So, I don't read all these dreadful social justice books because I enjoy it. I read it so that I'm informed about what it is I'm talking about. And also because every now and then they will have a good point. I mean, that's the other thing, is that it's not the case that anyone is 100% wrong. There are kernels of truth within the social justice movement. It's just unfortunately skewed and destroyed by all the other stuff. So, I think I understand why you wouldn't want to read all these holy texts, but I think it's probably, if you are going to criticize, as you do, and I know you do make the effort, but I think you have to have a level of, you have to be informed. I mean, no opinion that is ill-informed is useful, is it?
Yeah, that's a great point. I suppose, since I've gone through everything I really wanted to touch on, it might be a good time to ask you if you've got any Netflix recommendations. I think I'm going to start asking all my guests that while we're under lockdown. Yeah,
well, I mean, I've had a lot more. I've actually spent a lot more time reading than anything else. But yeah, I'm watching Better Call Saul. I'm late to the party on that one, but I think it's really great. I think it's great, and I really like the kind of, he's such a tragic figure, and also you see him, you know where he's going, you know where the destination is.
See, that's the issue I have with it, because I was a huge fan of Breaking Bad, and I then tuned into Better Call Saul, which is a prequel, and there's a distinct lack of jeopardy for me because I know how it ends. So there's scenes, for instance, where mobs are threatening to cut his finger off, and I'm they're not going to cut his finger off, obviously, because I've seen him. So, but I need to give that another go on your recommendation.
Well,
I think
that's what I mean. It's a different kind of show than Breaking Bad. It's more about tragic inevitability. That the fact that you know where he's going is part of the point. And I think that works really well. I really loved Afterlife, the new series of Afterlife. I think what I liked most was it doesn't shy away from it. I think the central character is continually, that he finds moments where he just can't, he breaks down. Yeah. And it's this thing about not shying away from the weight of grief. That it's just something that's permanent, that's constantly there, and it's that constant struggle. And I think some writers would have shied away from that out of fear of it being too insistent. But I think he really captures what that's like.
Yeah, and it's interesting how many people appreciate that, because I hear from people all the time now who not huge fans of Ricky in general, or haven't seen his stand-up or didn't catch The Office, who will say, I really love that Afterlife. Because
I think it's that thing of, it's people who've been through grief. And it's also something that we're all going to go through. And we all obviously did, in a sense, grief it's such a terrifying thing. It's such a terrifying, the prospect of losing someone upon whom you are so emotionally invested. It's the worst nightmare, isn't it? And yet it's one that we all will experience at one point. So how do you prepare for that? What a wonderful note to end on. Sorry, should I? Life is pain. Everyone you love's going to die. No. I'm not a pessimist. It reminds me of that scene. Did you ever see The Long Kiss Goodnight with Gina Davis? No. Where her daughter is skating and falls over and breaks her arm, and her mother, Gina Davis, pulls her up and says, "Life is pain. Get used to it." Yeah, it's terrifying. That's one of those films where people seem to have forgotten. Like, there's all these incredible action films where with females at the helm, women are the action heroes, and we're behaving in recent years like these things never happened. And The Long Kiss Goodnight is one of them. I'm a student of Aliens and the Terminator. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Even if you go back to some of George Romero's zombie flicks in the 80s, the female protagonists were portrayed as strong, capable women. It's not a new thing. No, but people like, the films with like Brie Larson and things like that, people keep claiming this is all a new thing. Finally, there's sort of this new, and it's like it's not true, is it?
No, definitely not. I think they tried this with Wonder Woman as well.
Yeah, but that was right. It was with the Wonder Woman, but it's almost like they have such a short memory and they think people can't Google. I mean, what about Uma Thurman? Like, what about Halle Berry's been a leading actor role? What about Pam Grier?
Yeah.
And there's all sorts. And like you say, Sigourney Weaver, Linda Hamilton, but this is like, what? It's so funny to me that people just, that's another thing that I'm really keen on with the stuff I write through Titania. It's just this flagrant revision of history for the sake of your argument.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could talk about entertainment in general, because I'm a massive nerd, and I say that in a positive sense. I love movies and entertainment in general, and I have noticed this creeping of woke identity politics into some of my favourite franchises and TV shows, and it never seems to be very well handled, because I do feel you can touch on the issues of sort of race, class, gender, anything really. It's all valid as far as art's concerned, but it's how you execute that.
Well, I think those sort of issues should be addressed through art, and the reason why you cringe probably when you see it is because when it's badly handled, it is about the intent. The intention is, we're going to educate you about the way you should think. That's why
it's finger wagging, isn't it? Yeah,
it's finger wagging, exactly. So, whereas a film which addresses issues of race or issues of misogyny, that's a different thing. I'm not talking about that. It's when suddenly there's a lesbian character out of nowhere, and she's there. It's been handled in. So I wouldn't care if back when I was growing up and I watched TV or whatever. Like, if there's a gay character or whatever, you don't notice it. Like, it's a new thing that you notice it now, and now you realise what it's for. And you just feel patronised. You don't need to be taught that it's okay to be gay. We know that. Polite society agreed on that ages ago. That's the other thing. Like, you're always going to get racists and bigots and homophobes and everything, the freaks of society. But the vast majority of us, what we call polite society, we had this down 15 years ago, right? 10, 15. We were fine. Like, we don't need to be educated by media moguls and people in Hollywood, and it's just fucking absurd. Yeah. I don't need to see these. I don't need to feel represented as a gay person in TV shows.
Yeah, surely entertainment's there for a certain amount of escapism as well. I don't want to be. There's no way I want to see whole TV shows about working class northern lads with podcasts. Right. That's not what I'm. That's not what I'm here for.
Well, like if you see. Like, if you're EastEnders, for instance, which is set in sort of middle London in 2020, if there were no people of colour or gay people in that, it would be weird and incongruous and inauthentic and all the rest of it. So there's it's not about that there's a problem with diversity. It's when the diversity is there as a kind of pedagogical tool. It's perhaps there when it shouldn't be there. In order to sort of sermonize and castigate you for not being sufficiently inclusive in your life. That's how it feels to me.
Yeah, we all notice it. It's like being hit over the face with a hammer. It's just...
it's fucking annoying.
Yeah. We all see it. We all know it. It's the eye roller. Andrew, this has flown by, as usual. I always enjoy speaking to you.
Spoken for? I don't even know.
It's been a while. I think proper conversation must have been recording Deadly Serious last time I think we spoke.
That's right. That's true. But we've been, and tonight, yes, this has flown by. So thank you for chatting. It's been fun. We've always got a lot to catch up on.
We do. We should do this more often.
We should. It'd be nice to do it in person as well.
Yeah.
Last time I saw you, I think, was probably at the Battle of Ideas, was it?
That's a tough one. I can't remember. There was a period when we bumped into each other every week. Yeah. And to be honest, it was getting a bit awkward.
Yeah.
So, I think that this pandemic's been a blessing.
Fair enough.
It's always a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you soon when all this madness has ended.
Yeah. See you in the real world.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated, thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?